So there we've got a little mask situation going on. You're trying to give David a run for his money and watch class from strange places, right?
Well, I kind of forgot that we weren't meeting in person. I forgot that you changed it to online only. So like I walked to the classroom like an idiot.
Well, how's it look?
It was good. I
I
mean, but it,
haven't
you know.
I haven't even been on I haven't well, I've been on campus twice. No, once, but not for class. I had to well, I went up for testing obviously and then something else. Um, but I haven't been in the classroom, so I don't know what they've done in there. It's coming. Eventually it's coming. Um, so yeah, you can just sort of play the home game here until you until you get back to wherever you're headed. So before we get into this week's submissions, and I should have had, and I didn't print out what I needed, so I'm just going to have to make some notes here as we go. Apologize for that. Okay. I wanted to take a look at a couple of late submissions, one from week one and one from week two. Um, if there were a lot of these, well, yeah, we should still give everybody their due here. So let me pull up and share my screen with you guys. So Ashton, thank you for submitting that first assignment, even though you weren't in class. You got, you did submit, so that's a huge plus in your favor. So one thing, a couple things that you missed in the class is that attendance and assignments, at least through the first half of the semester, are really key because at this point I don't have anything else to go on. I don't have anything to grade you on at this point. It's very subjective, so that's really the only objective thing that I have. So there is a point system. Missing a class or missing an assignment knocks points off of that. So the fact that you got those in was a big plus in your favor. So I'm going to take a look. So guys, if you remember the first week, the first assignment, I just wanted you to submit 3 images that you had done that you were happy with. And as soon as I can get this shared, there we go. We'll take a look at Ashton's from the first week. And we're going to go through these. I'm going to pull them up one at a time and ask you a few questions, and you can tell me a few things. Now they are pretty small. I'm not sure why they came in only like 379 pixels, so they're going to be a little tough to see. I'm trying to see if there's a way that I can.
I think I submitted them through, I made them like an icon on my desktop, and I think that's why they might be so small.
Okay. So yeah, this is about the biggest I'm going to be able to make them. So we'll just kind of, muddle through with what we can see here. And I also, yeah, I also, before last class, I installed a little program that I thought would be really cool and really helpful to highlight parts of my screen when I'm sharing my screen to show you what it is that I want you to see. And then I realized when I watched the recording back that it didn't record. So I've got this little thing, like right now, I've got this the screen has gone dark except for a little circle that I can, place over things and highlight. And I noticed when I watched the recording back that it's not there. So if I seemed like I was pointing out things last week that you weren't quite getting, that's the reason why. I thought you were able to see that. It's weird when you do a screen share that the things you can and the things you can't see. All right, so Ashton, I'll tell you, well, first of all, I want you to tell me what the photographs are and why you submitted them. So we'll start with the one that's highlighted. It looks like a bouquet.
Okay, so I've never really used like a camera like we need for this class, but I got a I think it's called a Canon Rebel.
Gotcha.
So I kind of just went around my house and took pictures. Well, I took pictures of the bouquet because I thought the colors were pretty in them and I thought they would stand out. But yeah, I kind of was just messing around because I've never really used it. So I just took like pictures that looked interesting to me.
Okay, so I will tell you, I'll make a comment on the first one, and you're right.
Mhm.
The contrast between the flowers and the background being very monochromatic, subdued. It's even in the same color key as the bouquet. Everything's on the
Yeah.
warm tones. So, I mean, there's some minor exposure. I mean, the exposure is pretty good. There's a few hot spots in the flowers, but overall, if you're looking to highlight a subject, that's a good way. That's one good way to do it. And these comments for the whole class too, not just for you. So there's a couple of things that you can do to make a subject pop out. One is to contrast the subject with the background in some way, whether it's color or distance. Distance is another big one because that'll blur a background depending on how the camera is set. So it has a tendency to pop out that foreground. And that's what happened here. Now, I'm not sure how it's lit. It looks like maybe just an overhead desk lamp or something, but it's a hard light source. I can see the shadow underneath. Um, which again, for a subject like this, isn't a bad way to light it. We haven't talked about lighting at all yet, but we will. And I will, like an image like this, I can tell you there would have been ways to light it a little bit differently to even bring that out more. But for a first attempt with a camera you've never used, pretty good. It's actually, I think, probably the strongest of your three images. So let's take a look at this one. And so this is kind of almost the reverse of what I was just saying. Um, and one of the things that I mentioned in one of the earlier classes is that we have to try one of the hardest things to do when you start doing photography is to see what the camera sees and not what your eye sees, because we see in stereo, we see in 3 dimensions, we see a lot of detail peripherally that the camera doesn't see. And so when you look at something like this, I can imagine that when you looked at whatever, I'm sure it looks like a small tree or something in the center. It probably stood out a lot more than it does in this photograph. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it does a little bit. I mean, there's a difference in tonality, a little difference in lighting, but overall, because the fact that the background is about as sharp as the foreground, at least it appears to be, it tends to not stand out as much. And that's just one of those things that, um, you know, we see something, our eyes see it, and we pick the camera up, take a snap of it, and then are kind of disappointed later, and we're not really sure why. In this case, it was probably more of a matter of separation.
Yeah. The tree, it like when I took the picture, it really blends in with the background, so I probably shouldn't have used it.
And I don't know physically how it was set up for distance or anything like
Yeah.
that, but a very wide aperture on the camera
Mhm.
could have possibly blurred out that background. I don't know.
Yeah.
Without, you know, seeing it physically, it's hard to say, but I understand why, you know, what you were doing here.
Yeah.
The third one, so I'm going to have you, well, I don't know if there's anything specifically about this that you want to talk about that you thought was cool, and then I'll tell you what my thoughts are.
No, the colors just like stood out to me, but it like doesn't really blur the background.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's due to, and I don't know if the metadata came in. No, it did not with these. Same problem we had with Amelia. I have some basic information, but because of the way you created the file rather than sending what came out of the camera, I don't have uh, it's not telling me the camera settings or anything like that. So, but my guess is that it's probably a high ISO, a narrow aperture, which, you know, will keep more of the background in focus. So the first thing that I see when I look at it is that basketball
Yeah,
backboard in the background, you
yeah.
know, which literally, had you taken one step to your right, the flag covers that and
Yeah.
takes and becomes and then the flag will separate against the background because of color contrast. There's no
Yeah.
red, there's no blue back there, so it would have separated a little bit more. And then the other thing, and this is a little this is tricky to figure out, but it's verticals and horizontals. So the porch, you can see is on an angle, like the camera was tilted a little bit, so that
Yeah.
horse post is coming up. So if the camera is going to be off, you either need to do it a lot and make it obvious that it was done intentionally, or those verticals really need to be vertical and the horizontals need to be horizontal. Because otherwise it, has a tendency to make us want to do this, and look at it with
Yeah.
our heads cocked to the side to try to straighten that up. And the worst place for doing that is pictures of like the ocean or a lake or something like that. If your horizon line is off and there's water in the image, it just looks like the ocean's running out of the picture. So that's probably the worst place to it's not as bad as this, this isn't as bad as that, but for pictures like that, you really want to make sure you're aware of that. Let me make a change here, guys. Trying to get a window that I can see. Well, there we go. I just want to make sure, because I know sometimes some of you have dropped out, like internet has dropped or whatever, and I don't necessarily see you trying to get back in. So if that happens, by the way, and you can't, text me. My number, I don't know if my number is on my contact for the class or not, but if you have something to write this down with, I'll give you the number right now, and you can text me, not just about this, but about anything. So that's usually a quicker way to get me than email. I do respond to email pretty much every day, but it may only be once a day. So text is a little faster. So the number is 304-280-4593. And I'll make sure I put that in an announcement or something. The next announcement that goes out, I'll make sure that I put that in there. But yeah, if you get bumped off or anything, text me. So I have my phone sitting here. I should see that. And for your information, Ashton, since you weren't here, most people look like they're keeping you don't have to, but most people look like they're keeping their audio muted. You don't have to, but if you do, and you have something to say or you have a question, just unmute yourself and speak up. There's only 15 of us counting me, so I don't think we're going to have an issue with everybody talking over each other.
Okay.
All right. So, and then James, you had submitted yours a little bit later, and I wanted to make sure we had a chance to go over those too. So I'm going to pull those up. Let me move this. I'll try to move this. There we go. Get into my editing mode. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to have you tell me what we're looking at on a couple of these and why you did them and what you were going for, and then I'll make a few comments. And
All right.
Is it Jamie? You have Jamie I see on screen, but I have James on the list. So does it matter?
It doesn't really matter. I go by Jamie the majority of the time, but
Okay.
It's not a big deal, really.
Well, Jamie is, I don't know, sounds better to me, so
Yeah.
that's what we'll go with.
This picture was, so I got my camera for Christmas like 2 years ago, I want to say, maybe 3, and I got a pair of beam boots, and I was just kind of messing around with the camera and took that picture.
So I like the way it's done. I mean, this is one of the things, and we talked a little bit about selective focus already. This is one of a good use of that. Even though the photograph itself, is nothing overly dramatic or exciting about it, the fact that you took a pretty mundane subject and made it visually a little more interesting, I do like that. So the focus obviously is on the name. And then even though we see the rest of it, it kind of falls, almost looks like the Star Wars, opening or something. It's all of the focus is off in the back. But that's a cool effect when you want to highlight something. And it's also a good indication of that 1/3, 2/3 rule that we talked about with focusing. So the closer you get to a subject, the harder it is to keep it all in focus. So understanding that typically 2/3 behind what you focus on and 1/3 in front will be acceptably sharp. And that really plays out here. You can really see that there's more acceptable focus behind that than there is in front of it. That line in front is already starting to fall out. So a good example of that. And overall, good. The color harmony is good. It's not a busy image at all. So for a mundane subject, it's a pretty good representation. So I like that. This one, I will be honest, confused the heck out of me.
Yeah. My bad. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Right.
So last year, I got kind of back into photography a lot, and me and my buddy ordered some takeout, and I took this picture, and there's actually like 4 different versions of this picture. But I swear on my camera, it looked like slightly more focused, but here I was trying to kind of go for like some background blur where you can like make us out, but I thought it was a little more clear than this.
Yeah, and so when you use background blur, the key to making that work is that there has to be something in the image that is sharp and something that is interesting, like that is an obvious subject. So let's say in this case there had been a little action figure or something. I'm just off the top of my head on that table in front that was in focus. Now you've got a much more interesting photograph and a reason for having that background to blur. But the whole, there's almost a third of this image is taken up by something that we're really not sure what it is. So
Yeah.
but I get what you were going for. You just need there almost always has to be, you have to be able to look at an image and say immediately, that's the subject. That's what he was taking a picture of. In this case, I just wasn't sure. Now this one, what was this shot through?
I actually took a red solo cup and put it around the lens of my camera.
Gotcha. So yes. I'm going to tell you that if there had been just a couple of things done a little differently, this would have been awesome. I mean, it's pretty good the way it is, but I'm sure you can probably guess the first thing I'm gonna pick at, right?
Probably. I messed with the white balance a lot on this photo, and I couldn't ever find what I wanted from it.
So, and I can see that. I can see that the white balance, but in an image like this, you can get by with a little bit of color infidelity because it's a little more of an abstract almost. So you're not, even though, and the Coca-Cola red is a trademarked color of red, but it doesn't represent too far off from that here to be an issue. But what I'm saying, if I can envision this picture with, I don't know if that's you or somebody else sitting there, but if I can envision this picture without that person, wow, it takes on a whole new, then you really don't have a clue. You've taken away a lot of the visual clues about what this is and how you're looking at it. So a couple of things I would have done just a little differently. One, obviously remove the person in the chair. Two, move the can a little more to the right so that it's in the middle. See how the table sort of cuts off here on the left, whereas on the right it creates a horizon. If that horizon line was straight across all the way, the can is dead center and that person isn't back there, then man, this is a prize winner if those things are done. So again, I like the fact that you've done really selective focus. I am a fan of that. I do a lot of that myself in almost everything I shoot, unless it's product. So, keep that up, keep working that angle. It seems to be, a strong point for you. But yeah, just, you got to always watch background distractions. Can anybody else see, there's one other background distraction. Anybody else want to take a stab at what it is?
The light in the cup?
Yeah, actually, so that's not what I was going for. You're talking about on the left side here. It is a little bit, like I said, if you squint at an image, you don't want the first thing you see to be something other than the subject. And I do see that more. But if you squint, there's, in addition to the person in the background and that highlight on the left, there is one other thing that should stand out to you.
Whatever's up on the wall on the right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a contrast issue. It's because that whole wall is light and bright colored and you've got that one little dark spot. So again, I know at some point you guys are going to start thinking, my God, he's nitpicking everything. But if I do that, and I get you guys to start thinking that way, you'll see these things before you even push the button. And that's the goal, is to make, not to create perfect images, but to do as much in camera to eliminate distractions and to draw the subject's eye to where you want it to be, is huge. So, but overall on this shot, Jamie, really well done. Really like it.
Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to move into this week, and I'm going to tell you that it was how do I want to say, an epic fail on many fronts. There were only a couple of people that I think really grasped actually, I probably should look at one of those first, and then we'll back out into these. There, one or two people I think really seemed to grasp the concept of the assignment, which I thought was pretty simple, but there may have been issues, and there may still be issues on your part of knowing how and where to access certain controls on your camera. Let me go through and look here and see. Uh-oh, it just kind of froze up. Let's try this again. There we go. So Jacob, I think I'm going to double check your metadata here, but I think of all the ones that I got, I think you were the closest to doing exactly what I wanted. So here were the key elements. Number one, the image should have the same exposure in all three versions. Okay, that was the number one key. What I wanted you to do was make changes to your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed, which if in manual mode is going to affect the exposure, and then figure out what you had to change either in ISO, shutter speed, or aperture to bring that exposure back to where it should have been. So if you look in the metadata, and that's what is all on the left-hand side of the screen, and in the very upper left-hand corner, you'll see that it shows you the camera settings. So f8, this first image was shot at f8, a 60th of a second, and the ISO is at 3200. So if we go to the second image and compare those numbers, we see, first of all, the ISO went from 3200 to 800. Anybody can tell me how many stops of difference that is? So remember the little chart that we uploaded and looked at the first week on exposure that had ISO at the bottom, shutter speed in the middle, and aperture at the top, and this side was brighter, that side was darker. So from ISO 3200 to 800, we talked about how that works mathematically. Does anybody remember or can figure out how many steps that is from 3200 to 800? How many stops of light differently should that be? And I don't have, probably have that file. Let me see if I can find it here. All right, it's not in there. Oh, here it is. Okay. So let me highlight this. So he went from, and here's the ISO on the bottom. He went from ISO 3200 down to 800. So how many steps of light is that?
2.
Who said?
I said 2.
Okay, so it is. It's two stops, and you can use the word step or stop. Stop is the stop is sort of like it's the accepted photography term. All of these ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop or aperture, all of these, when you go from one to the other, if you only go one from one to the one adjacent, that's considered one stop of light. And all of these, as we said before, and I'm going to say this over and over again until it becomes second nature, but every time you make one jump from one of those numbers to the other, whether it's ISO, shutter speed, or aperture, you're either doubling the amount of light or cutting the amount of light in half that's coming into the camera. So if he was at ISO 3200 and then he went to ISO 800 and it's 2 stops different, is that 2 stops brighter or 2 stops darker?
Darker.
Yes, correct. So the lower ISO numbers are going to darken your image. But again, as you see here, less noise, and then the higher ones are more noise, but less light required. So we know from that first step, okay, he went from 3200 to 800. So we know he lost 2 stops of light. So in order to keep the exposure where it should have been, he had to make up that 2 stops somewhere. So let's go figure out where he did that. Let's get back into this. Okay, so ISO 3200, then to ISO 800, 2 stops. So let's see where he did it. Well, let's look at his shutter speed. His shutter speed was a 60th of a second in the first image. It went to a 1/4 of a second in the second image. So let me go back for a second to that chart. Sorry, this is really kind of challenging. So he went from a 1/4 of a second, or I'm sorry, from a 60th of a second to a 1/4 of a second. How many stops of light is that?
4.
Correct, that's 4. So he went 2 stops darker on the ISO and 2 stops bright, or I'm sorry, 4 stops brighter on the shutter speed. So where is he now? From his original exposure, if we just consider ISO and shutter speed, where is he from that original exposure? Brighter or darker, and by how much? He went 2 stops darker on the ISO, 4 stops brighter on the shutter speed. I know you know it. Somebody out there knows it.
Be 128, wouldn't it?
128, I'm not sure if I know what you're saying.
The ISO would be 128 or like 12,800.
Well, the question I'm asking though is if those were the only 2 things he changed, okay, from his first image, if he changed the ISO from 3200 to 800 and the shutter speed from a 60th to a 1/4, would the second, and those were the only 2 things he changed, would that exposure be brighter or darker than his original? And by how much? That's what I'm looking for.
Brighter.
Okay, and by how much?
What were the numbers again?
So 3200 to 800 on the ISO and a 60th to a 1/4 on the shutter speed. And this is good. I'm glad that these little exercises I probably couldn't come up with on my own, but this is helpful to figuring out how this works. So it's really right there on the chart in front of you. So let's start from the bottom. On the ISO, he made it 2 stops darker. On the shutter speed, he made it 4 stops brighter. So does it not stand to reason that his next exposure, if he doesn't change anything but those, would be 2 stops brighter than his original? Does that make any sense at all? So we went 4 stops here. He gained 4 stops of light on his shutter speed and lost 2 stops on his ISO. So the cumulative effect is 2 stops of increased exposure. Now, I don't remember what his, let's go back and look at what the ISO, or I'm sorry, what the aperture was. So his aperture was f8. And at this point, if he doesn't change the aperture, he's going to be 2 stops overexposed. So in his third image, to get that exposure back to where it should have been, I'm going to guess, and I haven't looked at this, I'm going to guess that his aperture is f16, because that's going to make 2 stops darker and bring that exposure back. So let's see if that's it. Oh, he did not change that. He changed his ISO and his shutter speed. Okay, which is fine. I mean, there were a lot of ways to do this. There were a lot of combinations that you could have used that would have achieved this effect. But let's see, from his original, we'll just use that and we'll disregard the middle one for right now. From his original, f8, a 60th of a second, ISO 3200, this one went to 6400, which the ISO makes it 1 stop brighter. And the shutter speed going from a 60th to 125th makes it 1 stop darker. So it compensated. And that's why the exposures are the same. So this wasn't a progression. Like he didn't start here. I mean, he probably did change this and then go from here to here. It wasn't a progression. They're just, the numbers are all different. But this is the key that I want you guys to really, really grasp this concept of how changing those numbers. And at this point, we're not looking at the whys, we're just looking at the hows. How changing those numbers kept his exposure the same, because if he increased his ISO, it would have made the image brighter. So to compensate for that, he had to take something else and make it darker, which he did. He made the shutter speed darker. And from the first image to the second, he made the made the aperture 2 stops darker. He made the ISO 2 stops darker, which is a cumulative effect of 4 stops, but he increased his shutter speed 4 stops to compensate for that. So again, all of these are the same exposure, but there's other things, there's other differences here. Can anybody see what else is different between these 3 images? I'm not sure how well you can see them. Let me see if I can get them up a little larger here. So we'll go through 1, 2, and 3. It's slight, but I'm seeing it mostly, I think, between 1 and 2. Let me put those together.
Is it the background?
Yeah, absolutely. The background on the one on the right, which is his first image, is a little bit more out of focus because that one was shot at f8. This one, number 2, was shot at f16. So a smaller aperture tends to focus the image more and put more of that in focus. So even though he balanced the exposure, it is going to have some visual differences. Okay, and we're kind of starting to get into that area. That's what we're going to start doing later today. Is not only that these things make changes in exposure, but why you would pick one over another. And I'll tell you just as an offhand comment, with me, I stick to aperture first, shutter speed second, and I only change the ISO if I need to. If I can't get the combination between aperture and shutter speed at whatever the ISO is set, then I'll change the ISO to get it. But typically, I want to keep that ISO as low as possible. I'm typically shooting around 200 on the ISO, and unless I'm indoors without supplemental light or something like that, that's plenty. Or if I'm in my studio, that's also plenty. But these 3 things control exposure, but I just wanted to point out while we're here, they also control a few things visually, and it is the background. So even though a couple of you got close to this, Jacob, you were the one who absolutely nailed it. Like you did exactly what the assignment was intended to do, was to make you figure out how to make those changes to get your exposure consistent throughout all 3. So this week is not a vote, because we're not looking at, what do we like in this image. This is more about a technical exercise. So you automatically got a point there back towards your grade. I'm making a note of that. And I think, I'm not sure, I know there were 1 or 2 others of you that were pretty close. And then most of you were not, but I want to know, what you were thinking as you did these. And Ashton, you're at a disadvantage because you were not in class. You only had what was written in the assignment to go by. So I'll kind of give you a pass on that, but let me look at your metadata here.
I gotta stop with the trees.
You did what?
I have to stop taking pictures of the trees.
Well, in this case, the subject matter didn't matter. It was all about the technical. So clearly we can see that the first 2 exposures match.
Yeah.
Or they're close, but the third one does not. It's off, and they should all be the same. And as I look at the camera settings, from 1 to 2, the shutter speed changed slightly, but not even an entire stop. So that's why you're not seeing a lot of difference there. The f-stop, aperture and ISO stayed the same. And then in the final one, the aperture still stayed the same, but the shutter speed increased, which is going to make the image brighter. So again, I'm going to cut you a little slack here because I know you weren't, you only had what was written in the assignment to go by, and didn't have the advantage of some of the stuff that everybody else did. But I'll ask you, based on what we just looked at with Jacob's images, do you have a better idea, a better, understanding of what the concept was?
Yeah, I was like trying to like mess with like the settings, and I was just a little confused, but because I thought there was supposed to be a major difference in the picture, and then that's why I thought the third one was right, but I just messed it up.
Yeah, well, if it's any consolation, so did almost everybody else. So don't worry too much. And that's fine. I don't mind. Like, I think it would have been a lot to expect to have all of you nail this, because this is a really foreign concept. This is not something that you're for the most part used to doing. The cameras are so automatic anymore that we take it for granted, that we pick it up and we point and shoot, and we're going to get a reasonably well-exposed image. But this class is more about teaching you how to create something in the camera that you have in your mind, like, oh, I want the background to be more out of focus, or I want that water to blur more. How do I do that? So that's why we're going through all this, to figure all of that out. All right, let's give me 1 second here. I'll pull something up on my other computer. 2020, there we go. All right, so Abby, you're next. And clearly we have kind of the reverse here. We have 2 underexposed images, and then we have one that is properly exposed. So the other thing that I'm seeing in a lot of the submissions is these in-between numbers. Like the shutter speed on this one is a 20th of a second. The aperture on this one is f/18. So if you refer back to that chart, these are not what we would consider whole numbers. They're in between the main shutter speeds. They're in between the main apertures. When you're working in manual mode and on an assignment like this, you have the ability to set those numbers on those whole numbers, and that makes it a lot easier to figure out than being on these in-between numbers. So Abby, tell me what it was that that confused you.
I thought we were just changing the settings.
Yeah, just so you knew where the settings were, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. And then I was like, man, I hope I'm not doing this wrong.
Yeah, and I probably could have explained it a little bit better. I thought that I had mentioned in there that all 3 exposures should look the same, but
You did, but I thought it meant make sure the room you're in stays at the same lighting.
yeah, and that's only the reason for that was the exercise doesn't work if the light levels are changing, and that's why I said if you're outside and the sun keeps going in and out behind a cloud, it's going to change the intensity of the light, and this exercise would be difficult, if not impossible. But so in your case, this image on the right is relatively correct as far as exposure. And so at f/8, a 13th of a second, which is again it's really hard to figure out these in-between shutter speeds. That's between a 15th.
My camera's weird. Whenever I tried looking for like some of the numbers that were on the chart, I couldn't find on my, like when I was going through, I couldn't find them. So I'm like, I feel really dumb, but I honestly can't find some of the numbers that are on.
Well, and I think I know the reason for that. So I'm just looking at your numbers here. So well, you're at f/11, so I'm not sure if that was your issue, and the ISO is high enough for that. Yeah, I'm not sure why the standard shutter speeds wouldn't be there at those settings. The one problem that I do know most of you will have, is in the aperture settings, because you have most of your lenses, if not all of them, have a floating aperture. And what that means is it doesn't go from, say, f/11 to f/8 to 5/6 to 4 to 2.8 the way mine do. A floating aperture, because they're a little less expensive lenses, means that when you get down to that wider setting, you may see where it says like f4 to 5.6, like it's a range. And what that means is that if you're at the widest zoom that lens offers, you can get f4 out of it. But when you zoom that lens in, the widest you're going to be able to go is f5.6, and it floats. So if you're zoomed halfway in, you're going to get a number in there that really doesn't, it's really not a whole number. It's not even close to a whole number. And so that's why that happens with aperture. I'm not sure why it happened with you on shutter speed with these settings, but that's something that we can hopefully look at. But you are close, you're so close to a 15th of a second, which is a standard shutter speed, that we can at least figure it out. So going from, this went from ISO 6400 to ISO 400. And let's take a look at that chart again. All right, I got to use a different method to find this because clearly that's not going to work. I got to wait for my, there we go, my screen to catch up. Get out of this. All right, it was in here. There we go. All right, so I said it went from, oh boy, now I've forgotten already. The ISO went from, it went to 400 from, from 6400. It went from 400 to 6400. All right. So you were right here at 6400 and you went to 400. So how many stops of light is that, and is it brighter or darker?
Darker, isn't it?
Yeah. As you go to the left, everything is darker. So how many stops is that though?
Now you're asking me math.
Well, if you can, if you can count to 5 or 10, you should be able to do this math. It's pretty simple. 6400 to 400. It's just a simple matter. Literally count how many blocks. Yeah, it's 4. That's it. So what you did, now again, we're just considering the ISO at this point, is you made your image 4 stops darker if you didn't change anything else. Let's see if you changed anything else.
I changed like everything.
So let's see. So you went from 6400 to 400. Your aperture was f11, shutter speed at 13. So you changed both, but you actually changed the aperture to a darker setting as well. So you went from f11 to f18. So that's about a stop and a half. So now you're like 5.5 stops darker. And your shutter speed went up. So a 13th to an 8th, which is a little less than 1 stop. So you're probably, the image on the left here is about 4.5 stops darker than the one on the right. So now knowing all that, can you think of one thing that you could have changed that would have brought these I'm not going to ask you details about specifics, but based on these numbers here, what one thing could you have changed? And it won't be the ISO because you already were up at 6400, but what could you change to bring that exposure back up to that?
Probably the aperture, wouldn't it?
Yeah, because you're at f18 and that's a pretty small aperture. So we're looking at 4.5 stops to get it back. So let's say, so 16 is a half a stop, then f11 is a stop and a half, f8 is 2.5, f5, 6 is 3.5, f4 is 4.5. Now your lens may not go down to f4. It might not. If it doesn't, that's when you have to look at changing shutter speed or ISO or something else to get that back. And so all of this is good. And I'm glad that this all happened the way it did, because I need you guys to start thinking about those scenarios. So if we're saying that the image is 4.5 stops too dark and you try to change the aperture, but your lens doesn't let you go far enough, that's when you look at one of the other settings. All right, now we'll change something else. It probably wouldn't do shutter speed because you're already down to an 1/8 of a second. So it's a pretty slow shutter speed. So that's to get that extra stop or whatever you need, then I would just pull the ISO back up from 400 to 800 and that would have worked.
Okay.
All right, so let's go to Taylor. Okay, so Taylor, you had one thing here that really kind of messed you up, I think. And that is that one of the images, we have a flash that fired. And maybe it did on all of them, I don't know. No, didn't fire on that one, didn't fire on that one, but it says it did fire on this one, and I can see the visual clue that it did. So that changes the whole ball game. The fact that you had a flash involved, it takes the whole manual process out of the mix. So let me look at, I'm going to ignore that image and we'll just look at the other two. So you did go from a very high ISO to a low ISO. You changed your shutter speed from 250 to 80, and the aperture went from 25 to 18. Now, I'm not going to sit and do the math right now on all three of those settings because they're, other than the ISO, they're in between again. But I can see that visually, it worked. You got the exposure back to where it should have been on this one. This middle one is just an anomaly because of the fact that you had a flash that fired.
Oh yeah, I was wondering about that. I was like, are we allowed to use flash or will it just mess everything up? But
Yeah, yeah,
so
it changes everything in this assignment. It changed everything.
so it are like all the exposures like the same, but like if you don't like manually change it on your camera,
I'm not sure if I know what you're asking exactly.
like the exposure, is it like something you have to manually like go into the settings and like change?
Yeah, if in this exercise you would have had to manually change, which you did. Oh no, I see you have another problem. You have a second problem. Right over here, the camera exposure mode, you were in auto exposure instead of manual.
Oh,
So the camera was kind of doing its own thing. When you're in auto, you really don't have much control. It's just
okay.
kind of doing its own thing based on what it thinks it's seeing in front of it. So yeah, no matter what you did here, these two might be the same, but it's the automatic exposure that did that, not you changing the manual settings.
Okay, I was like, all right, the exposure, you know, it'll probably be fine if I just don't touch it because I'm not changing it and they're supposed to be the same. But yeah, I didn't realize it was just changing it on its own. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
that little, and I think most of your cameras have a wheel on the top that'll say, it'll have an M for manual, it'll have an A for auto, might have a P for program, it'll have an A for aperture priority, and either an S or a TV for shutter priority. Those are the modes that we're talking about. You were an A for auto, and it should have been an M for manual. That would have given you full control. That would have made, you know, everything you did have an effect and a change, and the flash would not have fired. It won't do that in manual unless you tell it to.
Okay. Well, yeah, I like the like fuzziness of the first picture, how it's like really soft and not sharp.
Well, it is a little more of a, you know, because of the cropping that you've done on it, it's a little abstract. Personally, I want to see sharpness. Even there has to be something sharp in an image. If there's nothing sharp in an image, then your eye really doesn't have anything to settle on. You tend to want to limit what is sharp sometimes, but the one on the left to me really looks just more like an out of focus image, and the one on the far right is the one that, you know, my eye would go to. The one in the middle, the flash just, like I said, brought up some issues that yeah, we won't even address because they're outside the scope of the class. But we'll get to lighting and flash later on in a class down the road. But that was your main problem. Your camera was in auto instead of manual. So
Okay.
almost nothing you did was gonna help. It was gonna change anything. The camera in auto mode, it's doing the best it can to make that exposure look the same. So instead of using your brain, you use the camera's brain, and the camera brain's never as smart as our brains. We hope. We hope.
Yeah, like I had like on the outside of my camera, it's set to like manual, like out here, but I don't know, I guess up here it wasn't.
Yeah, that wheel trumps everything. So.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to move on, Chris. So a couple of things about yours. So we do have very similar exposures. Let me look. and there are changes to there are some changes to ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop. Probably not quite as many as I wanted to see, but the overall effect is the same. You were in manual mode, I can see that, and so you did have to make make adjustments to the settings to make the exposures. I'm not sure why one image is visually different than the other ones. All three of them should have been, and maybe you just changed something for.
I put a black light, so the one in the middle doesn't. I put a black light on it to like highlight it because that's what I did.
Yeah, gotcha. The background is different and all of that. That's why I was a little confused. But
What do you mean by the background? Oh, just with the box.
yeah,
Oh.
yeah, and the shoes are facing different directions and things like that. So, but it's the same location. It's the same lighting, other than the
kind of
black
what I
light.
thought. I just changed it a couple times. I didn't know like it had to be like the exact same. Thing. I thought you just meant like the same scene.
Yeah, and it didn't have to be exact as long as nothing else changed, like your camera position, your distance to the subject, the lighting. As long as all of that stayed consistent, turning a shoe this way or that, or moving a box in or out, it isn't going to affect the exposure. So that was fine. My intention was to not change anything, but the things that you changed did not affect the exposure, so it didn't matter. But yeah, I can see what you've got here in the metadata is enough of a change, even with the addition of the black light, which I can see in the outer images. You still have a pretty consistent exposure all the way across. This is also a really good technique for product photography. Whenever that glass or plexiglass or whatever it is that you're sitting on, to create a little reflection underneath that is always a neat.
Oh yeah, I had the light set up on them and everything.
Yeah, it looks good. I'll tell you too, though. Let me look at your focal length. Yeah. So the one thing that it can make it cool to play with, but as far like if this were a paying job, if the company had come to you and said, "Hey, we want you to photograph these shoes," and you had turned in with the lens that you shot this at, the focal length at 17 millimeters, they would have rejected it because the closer you are to a subject with a wider lens, the more it's going to elongate the closest things to the lens. And so guys, remember that when you're doing selfies too. There's a reason that they make selfie sticks. Okay, it gets the camera further away. If you take your camera, your cell phone or whatever, and you hold it right by your face, your nose is going to be the closest thing to that. And that ratio from camera to subject, and then the background is now your eyes and your ears. Those distances are so close that it's actually going to elongate your nose. It's going to give you a bigger nose. But you put that camera on a selfie stick, put it way out here, now the relationship between the distance of your nose and your eyes and your ears isn't all that great. It's all about ratio, not actual numbers. And that's why that image would look better than holding it in here. And so what happened on the two images on the right especially is the front of those shoes look, it's a cool effect. And I'm just alerting you that, be careful of that. Like if somebody says to you, "Hey, I want you to take a picture of, anything, any kind of a product, even food or anything like that. Watch the lens selection, because if you distort something, they may not like it."
That's a really small room. I tried to do it at least 24 millimeters, but I couldn't. I literally did not have enough space. So I did it in 17, but I do agree with you. I know what you're talking about.
You must have been like in a confessional or something. That's
This is actually in my basement. It's really like rustic. We just bought a house in West Liberty, and I like the brick in the background and everything, but it's seriously like I could touch both sides of the room. So it was so small, and I didn't want to put the shoes right on the background because then you wanted to have as much depth of field, blah blah blah. And then I had lights in there like over top of the shoes. It was definitely not the best shooting conditions, but yeah.
Well, for what you were working under, it came out. And let me make the point here again, guys, for the rest of you. Look at the background in these two images. Even though the distance between the shoes and the background is the same, if Can you see the bricks are much more out of focus in the left one, and that's because of the f-stop, the aperture used. That will control your depth of field and how much of the image is in focus. So, you know, that's where we're headed next, is the visual differences that these changes make. Right now, we're just kind of concentrating on the technical differences and the exposure. All right, so Haley, I think you did something right, but I'm not sure because, again, I don't have
Probably not.
the metadata did not come through, so I don't have the numbers to look at, but I can see, I do see differences in the depth of field. So I'm guessing that at the very least, your aperture did change. Your exposures are all the same. So if you did these in manual mode, then you probably did it right. I can't really verify that, but it looks correct to me. If I look at the shadow on the wall in this one on the left, as opposed to the one on the right, clearly they were done at different apertures. So unless you were doing this in automatic and the camera did all that for you, I would have to say you probably did it right.
Yeah, I did it in manual, and all the ISOs were 800 because it was inside, and then I just messed with the, you know, the other two.
Okay. Yeah. Now I wanted you to do all three because that's more confusing. But it's okay. I mean, as long as you're, you know, starting to see the concept here about, you know, it's a seesaw. These three numbers, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, they're a seesaw. One goes up, the other one's got to, one of the other ones has to go down to compensate, to keep the exposure the same. It just works. That's the way it works. And so it is simpler to only deal with two of them because it's pretty much up and down this way. When you deal with three, it's a little more confusing, but I do want you guys to understand how all three of them work. ISO, like I said, for the most part, I set it and forget it. It's not that I don't ever change it. I do. But I only change that if I'm in a lower light situation and I simply can't get the other numbers where I want them. I can't get the shutter speed high enough to hand hold a camera or whatever. That's why I'll move the ISO. I don't ever do that for visual reasons because when you take it up, the only visual changes are negative ones. You know, there's more noise in that image. So I don't like to do that if I don't have to. All right, Amelia. So again, I do not have metadata on yours either. I'm not sure.
Okay, I do.
Okay, I'm not sure why we have a difference in color balance on the three.
I used a flash for every single one because if I didn't, the picture would be completely black.
Okay, so yeah, and the flash takes the whole manual exposure thing out of the mix because the flash is now creating the exposure. So you emailed me about the problem, and so the answer that I sent you did not work. Is that correct?
I didn't get a follow-up email from you.
You didn't?
No.
I did send you one. Yeah, check your junk mail. It wouldn't surprise me if I'm in junk.
Let me check.
But my guess is that because your camera was in manual mode, it was set to settings that were just way too dark for the scene you were in, and that's why they were coming out black. And then when you turn the flash on, now you have enough light to create an exposure. That's my guess.
Yeah,
I'll copy what I sent you and I'll do a separate email rather than a reply and see if that helps. But yeah, I'm almost positive that was your problem, is that, you know, let's say your ISO might have been really low, your aperture might have been really high, your shutter speed might have been really high, and so when you take a picture, it's going to look black because there's just not enough light at those settings to create what you're looking for. And then the flash overpowered that.
Yeah, I can tell you what the ISO, the aperture, and the
Okay, tell me what you had.
The third term that I can't remember. Hold on. The shutter speed. The shutter speed for the one on the right was 1/100th, so in between 125 and 160.
Okay.
The aperture, I believe, was 16.
Mm-hmm.
And the ISO is 400.
Yeah, then I think that's probably what the issue was, because at those settings, I'm assuming you were like in your dorm room or something, just, with
Yeah,
just normal room light. Those settings would not give you enough light to get an exposure,
gotcha.
especially the aperture. The aperture was probably way too dark for that. So if you
Okay.
open that up to the maximum that your lens will allow, and increase the shutter speed and the ISO a little bit, you'll probably see an image. You'll probably,
Yeah.
the more you change those numbers, the more you'll see that image come up in exposure. So I'm
Yeah.
hoping that's what it is, and that you don't have a camera issue. But I
Yeah.
think
Well,
that,
the settings on my camera for aperture only goes up to 5.6. I can't go any wider than that.
yeah, and that's normal. That's not too unusual. Most of them are going to go, like the kit lenses that most of the cameras come with will go either to 3.5-6 or 5.6, meaning that you're only going to get 3.5 if it's at its widest setting. Everything else is going to be 5.6, or it might be 4-5.6. The fact that yours only goes to 5.6 is not actually probably helps you, because at least you know what you're getting. You're not in one of those in
Yeah.
between apertures, but that's not unusual for most of those lenses. So
Okay.
don't worry about that. But yeah, let
Yeah,
me know. Let me know if you make those changes and you start seeing images, because that's my guess.
Okay.
Is that they were just set too dark for the scene you were in.
Yeah. So the other settings on the other photos aren't really that different. So the settings for the one in the middle, my shutter speed was 1/200. My ISO, no, not my ISO. Yeah, my ISO was 800, and my shutter speed, my aperture was 32.
Oh wow, yeah. So that was 32 is like you'd have to have a lot of light to be able to see something at f32.
Yeah, I mean, clearly I didn't.
But that's good. I mean, if you don't have these issues, you don't have these problems, it's not gonna make sense to you. The solution won't make sense to you until you've had a problem and been able to fix it. So don't worry about that. That's pretty normal.
Yeah, and so the reason why the one on the left is blue is because I changed the white balance
Right.
to fluorescent light, because that's what I thought my room light was, and
So it might be, actually, it's hard to say. So we're going to talk about white balance probably next week, as far as how to do that and get accurate colors, no matter what you're shooting or where you're shooting.
yeah, I was pretty much messing with every setting I could possibly mess with without going off of manual mode to try and get the pictures to show up. I don't know how I didn't come across a way to, fix it.
Well, like I said, if your aperture was like between 16 and 32, it's just, that's like squinting your eyes almost shut and trying to
Yeah.
see what's in front of you. Like there's just not enough light coming through at those apertures. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure that's it. But if you make those changes and you still have a black image, let me know and we'll see if you don't have a camera problem. But I think that's going to do
Yeah.
it based on what you're telling me.
Yeah, because the aperture didn't go, or not the aperture, the aperture. I'm still learning these terms. This is the first time I've ever held a real camera. Yeah, my aperture was at 29. It didn't go higher than 32.
Yeah. And like I said, that's pretty small. That's like a pinhole trying to let light through a pinhole. And that's why I almost guarantee that's why your images were dark.
Yeah.
But no, don't worry. I think a lot of you are in the same boat here. Only a few of you have had any experience up till now with, a digital SLR. So don't worry about that at all. That's what we're here for. We'll figure it out. We'll get you there. All right.
So the ISO for the image on the left was 1600, and the shutter speed was 160.
And then
I'm
you
a
said
little. Go ahead.
the aperture on that one was what had to be really small.
Oh yeah,
29. Yeah, that's what did it to you.
Yeah. I'm a little nervous about going any lower for shutter speed because I shake. I'm a trembly lass.
So a couple things, you know, as you change your aperture, as you widen that aperture and open it up more, that's going to increase your shutter speed. It's going to make your shutter speeds faster and easier to hold. And that's one of the reasons we do that. That's one of the reasons that for using that more shallow depth of field. And then if you need to have more depth of field, if you need to have more of that image in focus, so you have to have your aperture smaller, that's when you go to the ISO and say, all right, we're just going to bump it up until I get a shutter speed that I can safely hand hold. That's one way. The other thing to consider, an inexpensive tripod with like a release that you don't actually have to touch the camera to do. Most of them now come with apps that you can control your camera from your phone. So that helps a lot. Or like I said before, some type of a, you know, put your camera on like a little bean bag or something so that it has some stability rather than trying to hold it. But tripod's definitely the best way to go, you know, if you can do it. All right, so Jacob, we already looked at yours. You had nailed it, so we're going to skip past you and go to Alana here. So in looking at your metadata, I can definitely see what happened. All three of them are different exposures, and it's borne out by the numbers in the metadata. This one is 2 stops brighter than that one. This one is 2 stops darker. So they're all kind of, you know, you changed the settings, but we didn't get you to where you got them to balance so that you got the same exposure. So you got half the assignment right. The part you didn't nail was getting them all to look the same. That's all.
Yeah.
Nope. I think you
I understand what you're supposed to do.
And that's, as long as you do, that's the cool thing. I don't want anybody to get to the end of this class and be like, I still don't get it. And if it's fine if you don't, but if you don't, for all that is holy, let me know before we go on, because I don't want to get too far down the road before, you know, and find out that you're still a little stuck on basic exposure. Don't worry if it's coming to you slowly, or if you still have to look at the chart to figure it out, that's fine. I just want you to be able to figure it out, you know? Like if you look at that chart and say, all right, well, I can see that, you know, this will do that and this will do that. You don't have to know it off by heart. You just have to know where to find that answer. Eventually you'll know it off by heart. So don't worry about that. All right, so I'm not going to dwell too much on the ones where I can figure out easily. So I'm going to go on to David, and yeah, same thing here. I'm seeing now there was a change. There were some changes like between this and this. Your shutter speed lengthened and your aperture changed slightly, but not enough to really affect the exposure. And then the same thing in the last one, the ISO just went from ISO 500 to 400, so there really wasn't a whole lot of change there. So all three of the images are roughly similar for exposure, but we didn't really get the changes in the manual settings that I was looking for. You know, I wanted you to go like, you know, 3 stops this way on your ISO and 2 stops this way on shutter speed and 1 on f-stop, you know, just so you get that, you know, figure out how to do that balance. So I'm hoping that based on all of the other problems that we're seeing here, that you guys are figuring it out, at least getting an idea for what it is that you did wrong. But I do have your metadata. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else in here. You were in manual mode, so no issues there. Yeah, everything else looks correct.
I hate to interrupt, but yes, it was the aperture. The aperture was way too big.
Yeah, there was no doubt about that. I would have bet money on it. Not a lot of money, but I would have bet money on it. All right. So let's just quickly, I'm going to look at the last couple here because I think we have mostly the same issues. It looks like there is a flash that fired on all of these. Yeah, there is. So again, even though it's in manual mode, We really didn't get the changes that I was looking for, like that. There are differences here in your settings, your f-stop, your shutter speed, and even the ISO, but the flash is kind of interfering with all of that because it's introducing a light source that it's sort of like I said about doing it outside with the sun going behind clouds. This is like almost, you know, the sun coming out and then going into full eclipse because the flash overpowers all ambient light. So it kind of negates all of the changes that you made to, you did make the changes, I can see that, to your settings, but the flash is what really brought that exposure out, not the settings. Because you can see there's a difference in the background, the density of the background between these first two, and that's because of the shutter speed and the intensity of the flash.
I was having that same problem where on manual it was just like black unless I put the flash on. Like the pictures were just showing up as like all black.
Yeah, and it's probably the same problem that Amelia was having, is that the numbers were just set too small and too low for the lighting conditions that you were in. And I wanted that to happen. I just wanted you to figure out why it was happening. Like, so here's one way that you can do this when we're doing a manual exposure exercise. You can put your camera in automatic, or you can put it in aperture priority or whatever, so that the camera is going to give you a good exposure for your initial shot. And then just look at the numbers, whatever the f-stop, ISO, and shutter speed are. Use that as your starting point when you go into manual. That way you will have at least an image that's relatively well exposed to start with, and then you can make changes to the numbers, and you'll still be in range. That's the part that I wish I had pointed out to everybody in the assignment, that it might have helped to do that as a starting point, because then you would have known what the exposure, what the settings should have been for the lighting condition that you were in. But that's, I'm sure the same thing happened to you for the same reason. Eva, you actually came really close here to getting it as well. As I look, there are differences in your settings. You are in manual mode, and all three exposures are relatively the same. There's a few slight differences, but overall, you got what I was looking for.
Okay.
Made changes to the manual exposure, but kept them all looking pretty much the same. So you, Chris, Haley, and Jacob were the ones who came closest to the assignment. And Jacob, you're the one that got it like right on the head. So good job. We got 4 of you that did pretty well. Okay, so we're gonna be a little adventurous here. I'm gonna try something I've never tried before. We're gonna take a little break, and I'm gonna reset. I'm gonna log in from my laptop, and we're gonna try to do a live demo. I don't know how well this is gonna work. There may be some technical issues, but if it does work, then it kind of sets us up for a lot of things for the rest of the semester. It'll let us know whether or not we have to do these things face to face, or whether we can do them this way. But I'm gonna try to do a live demo and show you. We're gonna get into the differences that are the visual differences between your aperture, shutter speeds, not so much the ISO, because I'm gonna keep that relatively consistent, and talk about some examples and some situations why you would change one over the other, and some pitfalls to avoid, how lens selection and focal length affect all of that. So we're gonna hopefully, we'll take about a 15-minute break. I'll get all of that set up, and so at 5:30 we'll log back in, and if everything goes right, keep your fingers crossed, we should be able to do this. If it doesn't work, then what I'm gonna do is actually record that as a video and put it up on YouTube. But we're going to try to do it live, because I want to have interaction. I want you to be able to ask questions. And obviously, if I'm just posting it to YouTube, I can't do that. So go take about a 15-minute break, and I will see you guys right after that. Hmm. Well, I can see we're going to have a technical problem here. How am I going to fix this? So my problem is I cannot be signed in on two networks at the same time, and I need a closed private network to use the software that I want to use. So I think I've got a workaround, but it's going to be a little more, just a little more convoluted. So I think what we're going to have to do, I'm going to have to take these images, and what I was planning to do was actually share the screen of the capture software. So as I'm shooting, you would see the images I'm taking. The problem is that it's not going to allow me to be on two networks at the same time. So I think what I'm going to have to do, you'll just have to kind of watch me. I'll try to explain what I'm doing. I'll take the images and then I will go back to my other computer, download them, and then we'll look at them that way. I think that's the only way this is going to work. Hadn't thought about that. I'm not sure if there's another way around it, but I'm not thinking of it right now. So that's what we're going to do. So
I hate to interrupt, but Abby needs to be let back in.
Oh, okay. I actually can't do that from here, I don't think. Let me look, because I'm not listed as the host here, because I'm on a different machine. Let me go in and take care of that. I'll be right back. Yeah, so like I was saying, until you try to do something a little differently, you're not really sure what problems you're going to run into. So that's kind of what we're doing here. I'll have to solve this issue, see if I can solve this issue for next time. So, but basically, I'll try to give you an idea. I'm just basically going to do these pictures in my kitchen. So I've got my camera set up. Let's go out here and take a look. This is my lens of choice is my 70-200. It's an f2.8, and that's what I do about 80% of my work with. And so I've got it set up and pointed at this little figure out here in my kitchen. Just this little guy right here. I think you can see him. Anyway, I'll try to turn this, probably just be better off to keep this on me, since we're not really going to see the images yet. We'll look at them once we're shot. But what I'm going to do is take a series of images with different lenses in different settings. So initially I'm going to shoot, and I just wanted you to kind of see a sense of scale here. From there's probably about 8 feet between my camera and the subject that I'm going to shoot. And there's about 5 feet from the subject to the background, which happens to be my oven. And the oven has a black door on it. It's a little white figurine, so I'm going to set it so that the figurine shows up in that little black door. So we're going to be looking at a couple of different things. One is how aperture affects, obviously, the background that we're working with, but also how the distance, as I change the distance from the camera to the subject using the same lens, how that affects it. And then by changing lenses and using the same apertures, what am I going to get along those lines? So we just want to kind of look at the results, but we'll have to do that after the fact. Like I said, I'll just have to take the photos and go from there. So initially I'm shooting, let me turn this down just a little bit. I've got the camera, I'm in manual mode. I'm at ISO 800 because I'm indoors, even though I've got good light, good west light coming through the window. I am indoors, and so the light level is a lot lower. And I want to shoot this first image at f/16. I want to try to get the background as sharp as I can. And so my shutter speed looks like it is set right now. Let's try 1/8 of a second and see what happens. It's a little bit underexposed, so I'm going to drop the shutter speed down. So I did it at 1/4 of a second, and that looks about correct. Let me make a couple of tweaks on this. Okay. All right, so I'm not changing anything, but I'm going to change the distance from the camera to the subject. I'm going to take it into what is the minimum focusing distance. With this lens, it's probably about 4 feet or so. Now I'll have to zoom the lens back out. I'm going to drop the center column on the tripod a little bit, and we'll shoot it again. Not sure if that's somebody coming in or leaving. Okay, so that's at f/16. Now we're going to change that and go all the way to the other end of the scale, and I'm going to shoot it at f/2.8. And that's because I'm going down about, what, 5-6 stops. From 16 to 2.8 is how many stops? 11, 8, 5, 6, 4, 2.8. That's 5 stops. So if my shutter speed was at 1/4 of a second and I need to compensate 5 stops, I need to take that up by 5. So we're going to go from 1/4 to 1/8, 15th, 30th, 60th, 125th. That should be about the right shutter speed. And let's just push and see if it is. Yeah, it's close. It looks like the distance has changed a little bit. I'm going to go back down to a 60th. And there we go. That's a pretty good exposure. We'll look at all of these again once I've got them downloaded. All right, so I'm also going to change lenses, which is a little tricky based on how we're doing this. So it's not a trick, it's a tip. One thing, when you change lenses, if you do have more than one lens for your camera and you're going to change lenses, turn your camera off first. If you're using a traditional SLR like this is, what the problem is that the sensor in the camera is actually, it's called a charged coupled device, meaning that there is electricity flowing through it. And what happens is when you're changing lenses, if the camera's on, the sensor actually becomes a magnet. And if there's any dust floating around out there, it's going to suck that dust right into your camera lens and give you some issues with dust on your sensor. So I'm going to change from the 70 to 200 to the 24 to 70. It's also a maximum f/2.8 lens, but it's obviously a much shorter lens. And so when I put this on from the distance that I'm at right now, I may or may not be able to get the same subject size. So think about that for a second. If I'm changing the focal length of the lens from, I was shooting at probably 200 millimeters, and now I'm at, depending on where I'm set, if I'm wide out at 24 millimeters, that's going to create a much smaller image. So I need to zoom that in. I'm going to zoom it in all the way to the 70 millimeter setting, and it's still not close enough, but I'm going to shoot one anyway. Then I'm going to move the camera distance way in to try to get the subject size to be about the same as it was on the other shot. And so let's just see how close I need to be for that to happen. So that's about correct. I'm still shooting at f2.8. Let's go to 16 again and see what happens. Just to have the comparison images once we're done with this. Could I almost actually see it on the back of the camera there, but not quite. And then we'll do one last thing with this, and we'll change the lens one more time. And we're going to go super wide this time. This is a 17 to 35. And initially, of course, it's going to have a much wider field of view. It'll take a second here. There we go. We'll try to take this down to 2.8. Did you hear, I don't know, well, you probably can't because I've got the headset on, but I don't know if could you hear a difference in the shutter speed from 16 to 2.8? Listen to the shutter speed. I'm going to do another shot here. So that was at 2.8. Now if I go back to 16, did you hear that? Were you guys able to hear that at all?
I could.
Yeah, so what happens is obviously as you change one, and I went just for the sake of being fast, I went into aperture priority mode. So when I changed my f-stop, the camera automatically adjusted my shutter speed in the opposite direction, just like we were doing in the manual exposure exercise. Okay, so in aperture priority, I set the ISO and the aperture, and the camera will adjust the shutter speed to give me the right amount of light. And I just did that quickly just so we could get an exposure. So now we want to do this at 2.8, and I want to try and get it as close to the subject as I can, because I want the same, as much as possible, the same image size. Got to be far enough away that I can actually get focus. Okay. So that's our aperture exercise. We're going to do one more, and we're going to base it on shutter speed this time. And I think I need my 70 to 210 again, so let me change that. I can take this off. This little device that's on the top of my camera is what I was hoping to use. This sends the image wirelessly. Once I take it, it sends it wirelessly to a laptop or an iPad or a phone or whatever, so that I can not only see the image, but can control the camera from that as well. But unfortunately, it requires a network, and I can't broadcast via Zoom on one network and have a second network here. So I have to figure out how to. So this lens is actually so heavy that you see that there's a mounting plate on the lens itself. So rather than mount the camera to the tripod, you actually have to mount the lens to the tripod to center the weight up a little bit, because it's pretty heavy lens. So I want to do a couple of things along the same lines, but we're going to play with shutter speeds as well. So I'm going to go back to my f16 setting. I'm going to play with some water here in the sink. I don't know if you're not going to be able to see a ton just yet, but I'm just going to get the water trickling. All right, something like that might be about right. And at F16, I have to be a little further away. Still a little further. If you don't hear the camera beep, you know, if you don't hear that focus locking in, that means that you're too close to your subject. There, I just heard the beep. All right, so we're just going to take a shot at F16. I'm not even sure that I got what I wanted, but let's go down to F2.8 now. Okay, let me just double check my 16 shot. Yeah, it worked. It was fine. All right, so we have a series of images on the card now that play with both shutter speed and f-stop, and it's really hard to describe, you know, without you seeing them pop up. So I'm going to take them back into the other room, download the images, and then we'll look at them and decipher them a little bit more in detail. So bear with me. The other machine is still logged in. I just need to get in there. Leave all this stuff set here for now. And I'll take this with me too, so you guys get to watch me walk. This is so much fun. If somebody would have told me a year ago I was going to do this, I would have told them they were kind of nuts. Because I think you got to be a little nuts to do this. All right, I'm going to switch my audio as well. And I'm going to log out on this machine. All right. All right, I had to get out of the meeting because I was hearing feedback from myself. It might actually help you to see this part as well. So I'm going to share the screen for the downloading process. So when I put the card in the camera, I get this this window that pops up because I have my preferences set this way, that every time I put a card in the camera, this program, which is part of Adobe Bridge, pops up. It's called Adobe Photo Downloader. I don't know if you use it or not, but you can see it's a really good program for downloading. I do not recommend connecting a cable to your camera and then to your computer to download files, because in the off chance that your camera battery would die in the middle of a transfer, you can actually damage and lose some of your images. It can corrupt the card. So it's always better to pull the card out of the camera, put it in an external reader. In this case, it's built into the computer, and download. So I've just set it so that whenever I pop it in, this window comes up. I'm going to go into the advanced dialog, and I don't want to create subfolders, and I need to put this in a folder, not my pictures folder, but this is my raw files. Now, normally I don't have to do this. Up until recently, once you set this window, it stayed there. All of these changes, or all of these settings stayed where they were. And then when they updated Photoshop, I believe, or maybe it was not Photoshop, maybe it was my system software. I believe what it did is the folder that controls the preferences for this program is probably write protected, meaning I'm not allowed to make changes to it. And so I need to go in and change that so that these settings, these preferences that I change, stay the same, and they won't change from download to download. So it's really nice. When that happens, the window just pops up and you just hit Get Media and it'll just start to download these files. You can put your, there are metadata templates that you can create. You can put your copyright. I'm just going to put copyright 2020 in my name, and it embeds that information into all of these files. And what's really cool about that is that if there's ever a dispute, if you ever have a problem with somebody hijacking one of your images online or whatever, and they claim that it's not your image, it's theirs, if you have this embedded in the file, there's only a couple of ways you can actually strip that out, and most people don't know what it is. So you could always prove it's that your copyright is actually embedded in that image, and even copies of the file have the copyright embedded in it, because these are essentially raw files. So let me make sure that, yeah, there's nothing here I don't want. So we're just going to download those, and then we'll take a look at them. So far we've just looked at the technical reasons or the technical implications of changing f-stop, shutter speed, and ISO. Now we're going to look at the visual implications, because they all do have a very different visual. All right, so that should take us into Bridge. Let me share that screen. All right. And we want to change a couple of preferences here. All right, so I'm just going to leave them in this folder. And they're also raw files as well as JPEGs, because the software that I was hoping to use to show you these images requires a JPEG, but I always shoot raw files. So I've got duplicates of everything in here. I'm just going to change my sorting to type, and it's going to lump all of those JPEGs together, and then I can just select them all and delete them. So now I've got unique images. I've got 25 unique images. So let's just pull them up and look at them, and we can look at the metadata as well. I think I can do that in this window. Metadata. All right. So this was the first? Yeah, the first image I shot at f2.8 using the 70-200, and it was set actually at the maximum 200 millimeters. And so you can see my shutter speed was a 90th of a second. The ISO was 800, and the f-stop is 2.8. So obviously you can see immediately, you see the reason for using a wider aperture, because I'm shooting into my oven. That's my background. I mentioned to you in one of the earlier classes that you could actually do this, you know, using a dumpster as a background or something. If you blur it out enough, nobody really knows what you've got. So, sorry, I'm trying to get, somebody else got bumped out here. All right, welcome back, Ashton. Okay, so Ed, what's that?
My computer just went completely black, and all I did was hear your voice, but I couldn't see the screen.
Well, whenever that happens, just follow the sound of my voice and it will bring you back. All right, so I think we got everybody back. So all I was saying was that we're going to look at some differences here. Now, I'm focused, my focal point at f2.8 is on this piano player, this little piano player's left hand. So you can see that that area is really sharp, but you can see that his face is out. At f2.8, that's just illustrating how shallow that depth of field is. Now, I'm not at the minimum distance at this point, but I'm still pretty close. So as we come down, I think I just made a slight change on cropping, so that's pretty much the same image. Same settings on that one. May have changed the point of focus. I think I was just tweaking these to get the right image because all the metadata was the same. All right, so then, yeah, so now we got it cropped the way I wanted, adjusted the shutter speed a little bit back to 90. So that's actually our first shot. The other ones were all tests. All right, so that was the first one. Then we shot it at f16. So you can see the difference. Look at the oven in the background here as opposed to here. At f16, you're actually starting to see what that is. And the little table that the figurine is on You can see the back of it is completely out of focus at f2.8, and it's a lot sharper at f16. However, the figure is sharper as well. Even though I'm focused on the finger, the same as I was in the original image, he's much sharper, but the drawback is that the background is as well. To be honest, shooting something like this, you're probably going to be better off with a couple of things. Like if I was going to shoot this as a product in the studio, what do you think I might do to contrast this figurine from the background, but still make sure that it's acceptably sharp from front of the figurine to the back? What do you think I might do? Anybody got a clue?
Maybe a hair light?
Well, that would give me separation, but I'm talking more along the lines of focus. Like how would I maintain focus? But I don't want to shoot at f16 necessarily, depending on, you know, if I've got an oven behind him, right? So the advantage of being in a studio is that I could put like a piece of black seamless back there. And even if I'm shooting at f16 and that seamless paper is in focus, you're not going to see it. Okay, it's just a sheet of black, and it's going to record as black regardless of whether I'm at f2.8 or f16. So if I had to shoot this against something that was more recognizable, I would probably choose a middle aperture, maybe around f8. That would ensure that the figure is in relatively sharp focus throughout, but that the background isn't overly sharp. There would still be some loss of sharpness in the background. There's a way to even increase that. If I still wanted to shoot, let's say I really had to shoot this at f16. I really had to have this figure as sharp as possible, but the background is something recognizable. What can I do at f16 to make that background blur out? This is a really interesting question. So let me set it up for you again. I've got to shoot it at f16, narrow aperture, because I need this thing to be in focus, but I don't really want the background to be in focus. Have to shoot it at f16. The camera to subject distance has to be about the same because of the image size. How can I make the background blurrier without changing the aperture? We talk. Go ahead. Say that again.
Would it be your shutter speed?
Nope, shutter speed will not affect image sharpness at all. I mean, it will as far as camera shake is concerned, but I'm on a tripod, remember, so that doesn't matter. Shutter speed, I could shoot it at a half second, and it should be, you know, unless I bump the camera, it should be as sharp as it would be at, say, a 500th of a second. But we talked about something briefly, I think the first week. Go ahead.
I don't remember. I have it written down somewhere. Bokeh.
Well, you're on the right track. Okay, so bokeh is an out of focus highlight in the background. I can't think of a clue that I can give you without really giving it away, so I'll just tell you what it is. We talked about it's a ratio. You have your camera, you have your subject, and then you have your background. If I increase the distance between my subject and my background, but keep the distance from my camera to the subject the same, in other words, if I just move my camera and my subject further away from the background, even at the same f-stop, that background is going to be more out of focus. So if you have the luxury of moving your subject, if you're shooting a person, for example, and you're outside under a tree and there's a building behind them, and you really want to make sure that they're in complete focus, but you don't want to see that building, just move them further away from the building. And then the further you get from your background, the more out of focus it's going to be. So again, those are things that you really want to start to get in your head and understand how they work. So we're going to go from f16. We just changed a slight thing on the shutter speed. We're working for exposure here. Just looking at the lens, I think I still had the 200 on. I want to get to the next lens here. 70 to 200. Yeah, you can see here that moving the camera as close to the subject as I could get it, and still with that 70 to 200 and still at f2.8. Look how, and focusing on his fingers, look how out of focus his face is now. And there's literally, what, maybe an inch and a half difference between his hands and his head. But because the camera is so close, it's that 3-point ratio. If my camera's out here at f2.8, I'm going to have this a little bit more in focus. As my camera comes in closer to the subject, then I'm going to have an issue. The closer things, whatever I focus on will be sharp, and right in front and right in back is going to fall out. Now when I switch to the 24 to 70, look at the difference in the background. Okay, that you can't even tell what it is. Now you can actually see where you're at. Even at f2.8, you're starting to see a little more of that. So what I did was move the camera in closer to the background, okay, to give the same subject distance, or I'm sorry, subject size in the frame. And now I've got the blurry background again because I've changed that distance from camera to subject. I've gone from here to here and refocused on the subject, so the background now appears blurrier even at the same shutter speed. And this is at f16, this is at f2.8, so you can see the difference there. Now when we go to the 17 to 35, that's at f16 and that's at f2.8, but it's still, the background is still now recognizable, even at f2.8. The field of view has increased dramatically. We're seeing much more of the kitchen, even at that aperture. Let me go down. Whoops, sorry. Let's go down here. And now we're at f16 again. And then moving in as close as I could get to the subject to blur the background out. But remember, now what's happening is what I was talking, I think, Chris, to you earlier about those shoes being so close to the front of the lens. That wide angle lens being right on top of this subject, the focal point now looks like it's on his backhand, but look how far out of focus the front hand is, and look how a little bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's misshapen this thing a little bit. It's elongated the front. That's still not the word I'm looking for.
Distorted.
Distortion, thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. It's distorted the subject a little bit. Just because of the fact that I've changed the camera distance and now I've got a wide angle lens. So this is exactly what I was talking about earlier, doing a selfie with the camera right here as opposed to out at the end of a selfie stick. The closer you get the camera, the more distortion you're going to have with a subject. So for something like this, an item like this, I would want to use my 70 to 200. I'd want to back away as much as I could at a medium f-stop to keep all of that in focus, but I'd want to keep as much distance between the subject and the background as I could to blur that out. So just keep that in mind. And when you play with your camera, like taking pictures of people, play with that. Like with whatever lens you're using, you know, get right up in their grill and then back away and zoom in so that the head size is the same, and you're going to see a huge difference in the shape of their face. You'll also see difference in the sharpness of the background, even at the same aperture. So all of those things play a part. It's not just the aperture, it's that 3-point ratio: camera, subject, background. So these are the shutter speed images. So this first one was at f16, and the shutter speed is 1 second. Now remember, all I had was a drip. The water was just barely dripping out of that faucet, but at 1 second, it's made it a steady stream. When I go to the 30th of a second image, now I can actually start to see the water droplets coming off of that faucet. I can also see that the tip of the faucet needs cleaned. I do not drink water out of my faucet, though. So the other difference is the background. Look at how much more the faucet in the water pops out, because the background's more out of focus at 2.8 than it is at 16. So again, it's because of the distance. There's not a lot of distance between this faucet and the background. So when that's the case, you know, you've got to go to a wider aperture. All right. Let me go back to this. And I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. So to wrap up the thought process, your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture all control your exposure. Whether you're in an automatic mode or a manual mode, they all will control your exposure. Now, eventually, we're going to be working in what I call semi-automatic mode. That's what I recommend that you do your average everyday shooting in. And for me, it's almost always aperture priority. And so what that means is that I set the ISO based on the lighting conditions I'm in. If I'm in my studio or if I'm outside on a bright day, I'm at 1 or 200. If I'm inside, like I just was, I had it bumped up to 800. But I always want to keep that number as low as possible. I never, ever, ever, almost ever, shoot at an ISO that is 3200, 6400. The only time I would do that is if I was shooting like a concert or something that has, you know, very dim stage lighting. But you got to be careful. If there's spotlighting on that stage, it can be extremely bright in comparison to the rest. Getting exposures in a situation like that is a nightmare. Think about that for a second. If you've got a performer on stage and he's got a spotlight on him and the rest of the stage is lit with soft, you know, blue light or, you know, mixture of colors or whatever, our eyes can pick that up. Our eyes can go from the background to the foreground and adjust automatically. Your camera cannot. Your camera has to pick one or the other. It's going to either expose for the performer, or it's going to expose for the background. So how do you do that? Well, if there is a ton of difference, you have to make a choice. You either have to let your performer blow out and look like, you know, the Archangel Gabriel on stage to get the background looking right, or you expose for the performer and the background is likely to go dark, so dark that you may not see it. There's another option. I'll tell you that in a second, because the same thing happens in architectural photography. If you have to go into the interiors of a building, you know, I do a lot of like not just private homes that are on the market, on the real estate market, but also industrial places, particularly renovated industrial buildings and things like that that are now office spaces. And I photograph them for the websites. Well, you're inside, so you're in a much dimmer environment, but they all have these windows. And you have to either pick the exposure so that you can see what's outside the windows, in which case the room is going to go very dark, or you expose for the room and the windows do sort of what that highlight on the wall behind me is doing, and it blows out without detail. There is a hybrid option. Does anybody know what that is? Is there a way that you know of or can think of to get exposure correct in a situation like that? It's what I do all the time for interiors, to get the room and the windows to expose properly. And it's a little bit of a trick question because you can't do it in one shot. Did that give anyone a hint?
Are you saying take 2 shots and then fix it in post?
Yeah, multiple exposures. That's exactly what we do. So the camera can actually be set to automatically, when you push the button or when you push the release, to take 3 boy, my math is good, to take 3 exposures, 1 at a normal exposure, 1 at a +2 stops, and 1 at a -2 stops. So they go bang, 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 one right after the other. And now you've got an exposure for the room, and you probably have an exposure for the window. And then there's a variety of techniques that you can use to combine them. You can do it manually and mask out the areas you don't want to see, but there's also an automatic method in Photoshop that'll bring them together and create a high dynamic range image that way. And so that's really the only option short of the old school way. So before digital, when we were shooting film, we didn't have this option. We couldn't do it in post. There was no post. Can you think of what I might have had to do in a situation like that with a very dim interior and a very bright exterior shooting film? Can you think of what I might have had to do to balance that exposure and to make it look right? And this will come into play further down the line when we start talking about lighting. No idea? So let's identify the problem. What is the problem in that situation? What problem am I trying to solve? What problem am I having? Can you define that in words? Isn't it just simply a brightness issue, a contrast issue? Too dim inside, too bright outside, or vice versa? You know, just we've got too much of a difference in exposure from outside to inside. Well, if I can't take multiple exposures and fix that in post, if I have to do it in one exposure, there's really only one or two possibilities. They're old school answers, but they're things that you should think about because they're still viable techniques. Oh, come on. This is really simple, guys. I think you're overthinking it.
A light?
Bingo. Add light to the inside. Bring lights and raise the level of the interior so that it now matches the exterior. That's exactly what was done for years and years and years with film photographers, where they would literally painstakingly take an entire day to light a room. Now there's a friend of mine in Wisconsin, Stevens Point, Wisconsin, who's taken that a step further, and he does a light painting technique where he does, it could be several hundred exposures, where each exposure is lit just a piece of the image at a time, and then he assembles all that later. The effect is incredible. It's an effect that you cannot get any other way. He does it with automobiles, motorcycles, Lear jets, buildings, people, doesn't matter what it is. The guy can light anything. And just so you know, if there's a market for anything right now, last two summers ago, he was here in the area, and he was telling me that in the month of July alone, now he does a lot of different types of photography, but in the month of July alone, he billed light painting clients $42,000 just in 1 month, and just for light painting. That doesn't include portrait work. That doesn't include, you know, other commercial work. Just to go out and light paint a car or a building or whatever in 1 month was $42,000. So that's a pretty good sideline, a pretty good technique to learn. Chris, the little shoes that you photographed, something like that can be done with light painting to make those things just literally fly off the page. Small products are a lot easier to do. They're less involved, but the result is incredible. I'll show you guys some of that, you know, when we get into lighting. I'll show you some of the end results. It's just incredible. But that's one answer, bring light inside. The other answer would be to block light from the outside, okay? Those windows, you know, if there's blinds or shades or whatever, you can pull them down. The disadvantage of that is that you lose the ambience of the outside. If there's, you know, a nice landscape outside that you want to be able to see, that's not the answer. The answer is to light the inside. But right now what we do is just do multiple exposures and combine them together in post. So I don't know if I think I got off track there a little bit. Let me make sure I get back on track. Yeah, we were just talking about examples for why you would make certain changes in your shutter speeds as opposed to f-stop. So my thought process is always, because I do a lot of people, I probably do more people than anything, although any more architecture probably is a very close second. So with people, I want the backgrounds out of focus. That's just how I want to see it. So in aperture priority, I'm going to rack that down to f2.8. And it almost doesn't matter what the background is because I can get enough distance between the subject and the background to make it go out of focus. If I'm shooting something with motion, water, like we just did coming out of the faucet, then I'm going to be concerned with the shutter speed, but I actually still shoot that in aperture priority because as I adjust my aperture, it shows me what the resulting shutter speed would be. So I'm just going to adjust the aperture so that the shutter speed goes faster or slower, depending on where I want it. And that leads us to next week's assignment. So here's what I would like you to do. And again, I'll type all this up in a little while and post it. you're going to create 4 images, 4 total files, 2 scenes. Okay, one scene will be, those 2 images will be the same scene, and then the other 2 images will be the same scene as well. The first one will revolve around your aperture. I want you to shoot something both at your minimum and your maximum aperture. You can do more than 2 if you want to experiment with that distance between the backgrounds as well. But I want to see the effect that a minimum and maximum aperture have. I want you to see the effect, actually, of what the minimum and maximum aperture have on the same subject. You can, I would recommend, and I'll see about how I write this up, I would recommend keeping your camera to subject distance the same on both of those. If you want to change the background, subject to background distance, you can, but honestly, to really see this effect, you probably should keep all of it the same. Camera, subject, background, and only change the aperture. Now, of course, we want good exposures on both of them, right? So shoot these in manual mode, because as you change that aperture, you're going to have to change your shutter speed and or your ISO to compensate for the exposure difference. So your images should, all 4 images should be properly exposed, but the first 2 have different apertures. The second 2 will have different shutter speeds. So pick a subject that makes sense for that, okay? Think about, we just did running water. Think about leaves blowing in the air. Think about cars driving past. Anything that has motion, shoot one image where you stop the motion and one image where you allow the motion to blur. And try to pick the most appropriate shutter speed for that. Don't just necessarily show the most blur. Maybe a little bit of blur really gets the point across. But I just want you to play with again, play with the manual settings on the camera to get the exposures to work out right, but just different apertures on one set, different shutter speeds on another set. Does that make sense to everybody? Does it not make sense to anyone? All right, let me make sure we got, I think we still have everybody here. Yeah, we do. All right, so I will write this up. I will get it up on Sakai for you. There are also some new files that I added in the resource folder, which kind of talks a little bit about what we were just talking about, depth of field, apertures on your, you know, on the camera and the effect that it has. There's actually a couple of really good illustrations on there. I would pull them up and at least take a look at them, because it shows you visually that camera to subject to background distance, and when you change that, what it does to the look of the photograph. So they're just 1-page documents, and they're, you know, mostly illustrations. So pull those up and take a look before you do this. And I think there's one in there on shutter speed as well. I did everything that I knew you would need for the assignment. So we will plan at this point to still meet virtually next week. We're going to be getting down the road to the point where that's going to be more difficult, like it was today on the shooting end, but I'm still hoping to see everything settle down a little bit before we do that. And we'll let you know if and when that changes. So if you have any questions on the assignment, once it's posted, email me, text me, whatever. I'll put my number in there as well. Don't text me like at 3 a.m. That wouldn't be good. You might not like the answer you got back. I might throw words at you like I used when I broke my toe. I think I made up some words when I broke my toe. I think there's some new, I should have written them down. There were some good ones in there. All right, guys, so looks like it's still a decent day, a little bit of daylight left. David's already enjoying it. Hey, I didn't recognize you. Actually, you're outside now. That's cool. You actually look like you're in a fun place.
Outside on the patio.
What is that behind you? Is that over your right shoulder? I think it's your right shoulder. Yeah, it looked. Oh, I'm not sure. I thought at first it looked like an instrument, but I think it's a
tree.
A tree. Okay. Well, don't go play the tree. That's probably not a good idea. But yeah, I just looked up and I was like, wait a minute, he's not in a corner anymore. I like that. Good job. Yeah, I don't really pay much attention usually to the backgrounds of you guys, but I probably should. There's some, Ashton, I don't know what you got behind you, but the way you've got yourself off center there, you've got a really good composition going on and you've got a really simple background. So that looks pretty good. Looks like Chris is playing with some profile lighting here. He likes the light coming in from the side and gives it that little split light look on there. And
I like them fast shadows.
you like the what?
Fast shadows.
The shadows, yeah. Well, so before I let you go, let me make that comment. What is it? You know, photography is a two-dimensional medium, okay? When you look at a photograph, whether it's a paper photograph or on screen, you're only seeing two dimensions, but we see the world in three dimensions. So how do you represent three dimensions when you only have two? What is it about a photograph that you do that makes you see that in more than just the two dimensions? And it's the word photography gives you the clue. Do you know what photography literally means? It's from two Greek words. It means drawing with light. That's what photography means. So when you create shadows, highlights and shadows, it gives our brains clues to understand. Like I'm looking at Chris right now, and he's heavily lit from one side. So I see that transition of highlight to shadow, and it tells my brain that he is a three-dimensional subject. It gives me some other clues about the shape of his face as well. I'm lit directly from the front, which is probably the worst lighting that you can do with portrait lighting. But in this case, it's it's a little more appropriate for what I'm doing. But if I were going to photograph myself, I would definitely not. I would not have light coming from the camera position. So we'll get into that probably a few classes down. We'll get into some basic lighting techniques and some things you can do to improve the photographs. But for now, go enjoy the last rays of sunlight or daylight or whatever it is that we have. Have some dinner, and we'll see you guys in a week. Any questions before we go? And 3, 2, 1. Nope, out of here. See you guys later.